There are only a handful of people I have ever told about what I call the hidden suburb. Without exception, they have brushed off my account as either an overactive imagination or an attempt at storytelling with a surreal twist. But the mark it has left on me, both emotionally and physically, is something I have carried ever since. My therapist has been insisting that I need to let go, to find closure. So I made up my mind. I used to be an artist, and this feels like the right outlet. Here, where people are often more open to the bizarre, the unexplainable, and the downright disturbing, I am putting this story out there. In return, I get to unburden myself. Fair trade, right? Maybe by the end of this, I can finally leave it behind. It was back in 2009. I was 21 years old and had just dropped out of art school, moving back into my parents' house. To say I was down in the dumps would be an understatement. I tried diving back into my artwork in the weeks after returning home, but nothing clicked. I could not finish a single piece, and inspiration felt like a stranger I had no way of reaching. So I did what I always did when I was stuck. I went for a walk. The gated community where I lived was surrounded by rolling hills and wooded valleys. The tallest peak in the area was a rocky bluff that overlooked my street, accessible by a short but steep hike through a wooded trail. It was on one of those crisp autumn nights, as I trudged up that trail, that I first saw it. I was nearing the top of the hill when a strange glow caught my eye, lights spilling around the bend behind the cliff. As far as I knew, that side of the hill was nothing but wilderness, remote and untamed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I adjusted my angle to see more clearly. All I managed were fleeting glimpses of what appeared to be a stone wall radiating a cold, artificial light. The valley behind the cliff sat at a slightly higher elevation than the flat expanse where my neighborhood was, making it impossible to see from anywhere but the summit of the bluff. I hurried up to the top, eager to get a better look, and that was when I saw it. A neighborhood. Rows of cheaply constructed, cookie-cutter houses sprawled out in a circular pattern, encased by a high stone wall. A strange, inexplicable dread bubbled up inside me as I stared at the place. It felt fundamentally wrong, as though I was looking at something that should not exist. The streets were eerily empty, stretching out from the center like the spokes of a wheel. No cars. No signs of life. What made it even stranger was its complete isolation. There were no roads leading in or out. It was as though someone had plucked a piece of suburbia from the map and dropped it in the middle of nowhere. I stood there for a while, scanning the neighborhood, but I did not see a single movement. That unshakable feeling of wrongness eventually forced me to leave. The next day, I asked one of my neighbors if they knew when the development in the valley had gone up. They gave me a puzzled look and said, "There hasn't been any construction around here for years. My parents were out of town for the season, and I figured it was not worth calling them about." I tried pushing the memory of that strange place to the back of my mind, but any artist knows the restless frustration of being unable to create. The second time I saw the suburb, it was late at night, around 3 in the morning. I was wandering along the forest trail, guided only by the cracked asphalt beneath my feet and the occasional glint of moonlight breaking through the canopy. I reached a fork in the path. One route climbed uphill, while the other looped around the woods and back to its starting point without ever approaching the other side of the cliff. Too tired to tackle the incline, I took the easier path, completely unaware of what was waiting for me. As I walked, I noticed a solitary streetlight ahead, casting a beam of light that seemed almost out of place. Probably put there for safety, I thought, but as I got closer, I saw what the light revealed. A new path, freshly paved and perfectly smooth, winding into a part of the forest I had never explored. Tall lampposts lined the way, their glow cutting through the dense woods. I felt no fear, no unease, as I stepped onto the path. If anything, it seemed inviting. About halfway down the trail, I paused to glance over my shoulder, a habit I had picked up on late-night walks to make sure I was not being followed. That was when it hit me. The forest was utterly silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, not even the faintest breeze. The stillness was so profound it felt unnatural. I pressed on, But I kept looking back, the growing sense of unease gnawing at me. The path twisted and turned, eventually leading me to a clearing I had never encountered before. Instead of hitting the base of the hill as I had expected, I found myself at the edge of a hidden valley. And there it was again, behind an iron gate and high stone walls, the suburb. The gate stood open, unguarded. I peered inside, my eyes sweeping over the empty streets and lifeless houses. Porch lights flickered here and there, but there were no signs of people. No cars, no toys in the yards, not even a stray dog. It looked abandoned, yet the houses appeared strangely pristine, as if waiting for someone to move in. I stepped closer and reached through the gate, only to yank my hand back immediately. The air inside was different. While the night around me was cool and crisp, the space beyond the gate felt heavy, stagnant. It was not warm, exactly, but there was an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. For a long moment, I stood frozen, staring into the eerie emptiness. Something deep inside me told me to turn back. I took one last look, then started the long walk home, throwing cautious glances over my shoulder until the lights of the suburb disappeared into the darkness. That walk home left me feeling hollow in a way I had never experienced before. It was as if I had brushed up against something I was not meant to see, something that had changed me in a way I could not quite explain. In the weeks that followed, I avoided the trail altogether, refusing to let my curiosity drag me back to that place. But no matter how hard I tried, I could not get it out of my head. Every time I looked out my bedroom window, I thought I saw a faint glow in the distance. And every night, I dreamed of those streets, those empty houses, and that suffocating, alien stillness. In these dreams, I existed as something shapeless and unanchored, like a pale, featureless fog. I would drift silently through dimly flickering streetlights and weave my way through narrow yards. It was almost always nighttime, pitch black, the kind of darkness where the moon's glow seemed swallowed whole by a blanket of churning storm clouds. I was pursuing someone, though I could never explain why. It felt innate, like this pursuit was stitched into my very being. I would catch fleeting glimpses of them, just at the edges of my vision. No matter how desperately I tried to close the gap, they always slipped away, vanishing into that labyrinth of houses and shadowy yards. There was only one time I came close to reaching them. They had taken off down a side street lined with tall pines, their branches bowing under the weight of night. I ran too, though I had no voice to shout their name, assuming they even had one. All I had was this unshakable certainty that I could catch them. Time stretched and warped, as it often does in dreams, dragging me forward like I was wading through syrup. The flickering streetlights sputtered and then died all at once, plunging everything into a suffocating black void. In the last moments of light, I saw the figure darting in front of a house with a door painted bright red. Startlingly red, glossy and unnatural in its vibrancy. Until that point, every other door had been muted tones of gray or the occasional green. That red door felt wrong, and something primal in me recoiled from it. Just as the darkness enveloped everything, I heard the rattle of its doorknob, then the hollow slam of the door shutting. A deep, resonating boom rippled through the empty neighborhood, as though the door had been thrown open and shut in one violent, decisive instant. I swear I heard the beginnings of a scream, a sound drenched in pure terror, but it was snuffed out as quickly as it began. Then the lights flickered back on, revealing nothing. The figure was gone, and I never saw them again. In some of these dreams, the heavy clouds would momentarily part, and a thin, anemic sliver of moonlight would cut across the horizon like a blade. 3 times I saw him, suspended in the air, too far away to make out any details. His silhouette was barely visible against the faint light, but there he was, calmly strolling across the night sky, as though the laws of gravity had simply forgotten him. The 4th time was different. It was one of the rare moments when these dreams unfolded during the day. The sun blazed fiercely, its heat oppressive, and I was sitting in the shade of a willow tree in the yard of a house with a blue door. A shadow fell across me, and when I looked up to see its source, I saw him again. He was descending from the heavens, moving closer to the earth with an unnerving kind of grace. He wore a suit, and in one hand he held a red balloon. The balloon looked absurd, as though it was somehow the thing keeping him afloat, and scrawled across its surface in messy black marker was a crooked smiley face. His other hand gripped a briefcase. The sun's glare obscured his features, and I doubted whether he had a face at all, if he was even human. A jolt of fear snapped me out of the trance his descent had put me in. He was no more than 30 feet away now, and panic took over. I bolted toward the nearest house, instinct screaming at me to hide. Oddly enough, I had never thought to go inside any of the homes in my dreams before, but all hesitation evaporated in the face of this looming figure. I barely had a chance to register the interior of the house before the floor gave way beneath me. I was falling, plummeting into some bizarre, otherworldly tunnel. This place was a chaotic mishmash of corridors, raised walkways, and doorways of every imaginable kind. It was as though the innards of countless buildings had been gutted and fused together into one endless, nonsensical structure. The only thing that felt certain was that there was no end to it. I fell for what felt like forever until I woke with a start, gasping for air. My first instinct was to run to the window, searching for that faint, golden glow. But it was gone. Its absence hit me like a punch to the gut, and I realized something. I had spent years trying to create something original, something real. But everything I made felt hollow, like I was just cobbling together poor imitations of the genuine. The hidden suburb, this place I stumbled upon, it felt like the answer I had been searching for. It consumed me with the hope that it would finally be my muse. The very next morning, I practically sprinted to the spot where the trail had split. My breath caught when I saw it was gone, replaced by unbroken brush. For a moment, I thought maybe the undergrowth had simply crept over the road, but that made no sense for a freshly paved path. I waded into the weeds, searching, but they led nowhere. Frustrated and desperate, I turned back and scrambled up the hillside, lungs burning as I reached the top. I almost did not want to look. When I forced myself to, my stomach sank. Nothing. Just an endless canopy of forest, undisturbed. I sank into a deep funk after that, retreating to my room and telling myself that maybe it was better this way. Maybe this fleeting glimpse was mine alone, a secret experience no one else could claim. But the questions haunted me. What was it? Why had it appeared? And why had it disappeared? I refused to accept it as a trick of the mind. I knew what I saw. Now, I do not know what to call it other than a slice of some unimaginable hell, a place that should never have existed. By the time winter arrived, I had nearly given up trying to sketch or recreate its strange architecture. I stopped walking the trails altogether. Then, one night, after an argument with my parents about my future, I stormed out and found myself climbing that hill again. I needed air, stars, and space to clear my head. I did not even think about the suburb until I reached the summit and felt my heart sink at the sight of that same unchanging forest. I lit a cigarette and stared blankly at the valley below. When the cigarette burned down to the filter, I sighed heavily and turned to leave. I might have missed it if I had not glanced back one last time. There it was, the warm glow of the hidden suburb. Without thinking, I ran, legs moving before my mind could catch up. If I could undo one thing, it would be that glance. That moment changed everything. I reached the trail split and almost wept at the sight of those inviting lights. They beckoned me forward, and I slowed my pace, wanting to savor every detail. This time, I told myself I would remember it all. This time, I would make it count. My excitement faltered as I neared the gate. A creeping apprehension coiled around me, squeezing tighter with every step. Before I could second-guess myself, I climbed over the chain-link fence and dropped down on the other side. The impact jarred my knees, but the solid ground beneath my feet affirmed that this was real. At first, I moved cautiously, expecting the world to crack open or something else to go catastrophically wrong. But as I approached the first street sign, My nerves began to settle. My gait grew steadier, and I turned to glance back at the entrance gate, unaware that this would be the last time I'd ever lay eyes on it. The first house I approached was painted a cloyingly cheerful periwinkle, its facade a jarring contrast to the oppressive stillness of the suburb. Pressing my face to the window, I tried to peer inside, but the blinds were drawn, leaving only an impenetrable darkness beyond. My hand hovered over the door for a moment, an instinctive urge to knock rising within me. But then I froze, shuddering as the memory of my dream clawed its way to the surface. The door was white, pristine, almost freshly painted. Something about it felt off. The colors of the doors here, I realized, seemed to hold some kind of significance, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. I backed away and rounded a corner, finding myself on a wider stretch of road lined with more houses. Streetlights stood at uneven intervals along the sidewalks, their dim glow casting long shadows. A handful of porch lights flickered here and there, but most of the houses were dark, their windows like blind, staring eyes. I stayed in the shadows, avoiding the streetlights as much as possible, as if the darkness might offer some measure of protection. A side street leading to a cul-de-sac caught my attention, and I turned down it, my footsteps echoing faintly in the still air. That's when I saw it, a statue in the middle of the cul-de-sac. At first glance, it resembled a child, but as I drew closer, the uncanny details began to unravel. It was a grotesque assemblage of pipes, concrete, and rebar, twisted into the crude shape of a small human. The arms and legs were spindly rods of rusted metal, the torso a cylindrical chunk of concrete, and the head a flat, featureless disc. Metal shavings curled upward from its head like mockingly playful hair, and the face, if it could be called that, was painted on in broad, careless strokes. It bore the same crooked, unsettling smile as the red balloon from my dreams. I shivered, a laugh bubbling up in my throat. It was the kind of laugh that comes not from humor but from the sheer absurdity of a moment. Who had made this? And more importantly, why? It was grotesque and mysterious, and in that instant, I thought it might be the very thing I had been searching for. Something strange, something singular. I was right about only one of those things. Before leaving the cul-de-sac, I made sure to note the street name, Marion Court. The thought of returning with a camera filled me with excitement. Proof, I told myself. I needed proof that this place existed, that it wasn't just some fevered hallucination. But as I retraced my steps, something changed. The streets around me began to shift, subtle at first but growing more obvious with every corner I turned. The houses were no longer the same. They were close approximations, as though the suburb had been shuffled like a deck of cards and dealt anew. Panic clawed at my chest. I tried to backtrack, to return to Marion Court, but the streets were unrecognizable. I cursed myself for not paying closer attention, for not marking my path. But deep down, I knew this place didn't obey natural laws. It was fluid, mercurial, a maze that rearranged itself when no one was looking. My pace quickened, my footsteps growing louder against the pavement. I was too panicked to run just yet, caught in that anxious middle ground between a hurried walk and outright flight. My eyes darted in every direction, scanning the darkened houses, the shadowed corners, desperate for something familiar. Finally, I collapsed beneath a streetlight, my heart racing and my breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, I thought I could wait it out, collect myself. But as I sat there, a distinct and terrible sensation crept over me, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I scanned my surroundings, every window, every hedge, every patch of shadow. The weight of unseen eyes bore down on me, but I couldn't find their source. It wasn't until I looked up that the truth struck me. Shit. The streetlight above me bathed me in its cold, artificial glow, turning me into a beacon in the otherwise dark suburb. Countless windows, hidden within the shadows of trees and houses, stared down at me like the empty sockets of a skull. I was exposed, vulnerable. My nerves ignited and I bolted. I didn't stop to think. I just ran, diving into the darkest streets, the ones with the most twists and intersections, hoping to lose whatever had turned its gaze upon me. Even when the oppressive feeling of being watched began to fade, I didn't stop. My pace slowed to a jog, but I kept moving, taking every detour and doubling back on myself in an effort to shake off the dread that clung to me like a second skin. Finally, I decided to cut through a side yard, convinced that leaving the streets altogether might be my best chance at escape. I climbed over a wooden fence, my hands splintering against the rough surface, and dropped into a stranger's backyard. My plan was simple. Keep cutting through fences, yards, whatever I could find, until I was as far from this place as possible. It was a plan born of desperation, but at that moment it felt like my only option. The very first fence was an insurmountable obstacle. The rough wood dug into my palms as I tried to pull myself up, peering over the top into the backyard beyond. My breath caught in my throat. It was empty except for a well. A perfect, storybook stone well, its cobbled surface glowing faintly in the ambient moonlight. It even had a bucket and a rope dangling into its depths, as though waiting for someone to draw water. But that wasn't what froze me in place. A deep, echoing clatter rose from the well, reverberating through the ground like distant thunder. The sound was alive, moving, and impossibly close. I dropped back down to the ground as quietly as I could, landing on hands and knees. Without thinking, I scrambled into a patch of overgrown shrubbery, hoping its shadows would swallow me whole. Then it came, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. A roar, or maybe a scream, distorted and unnatural. It twisted and pitched wildly, like a broken siren trapped in a nightmare. The sound bounced off the houses, impossible to place, and for a horrifying instant, I swore it was directly behind me. My hands shot up to clamp over my mouth, silencing a scream before it could escape. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone, distant now, somewhere a street over. My body screamed at me to move, but fear anchored me in place. Crawl, I told myself. Crawl and stay hidden. On hands and knees, I moved blindly in the near pitch dark, my fingers scraping against dirt and weeds as I searched for deeper cover. My hand brushed what I thought was a solid wall, but when I leaned into it, I found only air. Before I could steady myself, I tipped forward and tumbled headlong down a slope. I fell, tumbling over jagged earth, the sharp edges tearing at my skin. Shock robbed me of breath, and by some miracle I didn't cry out. That silence saved me. As I lay sprawled at the bottom of the slope, bruised and gasping, the monstrosity emerged. Its final roar split the night, a sound so piercing it rattled my very bones. From my crumpled position, I could hear the earth quake under its footsteps, each one shaking the ground as it approached the fence I had failed to scale. Wood groaned, then splintered with a deafening crack as it tore through the barrier. I curled into myself, trembling, every nerve screaming for me to stay silent. My breath hitched as the creature's footsteps thundered past, each one receding farther and farther into the labyrinth of streets. Even after the sound faded into nothingness, I didn't move. I didn't dare. When I finally opened my eyes, I found myself staring up at an unfamiliar sky. The clouds had parted, revealing alien constellations scattered across an endless void. I wept silently, exhaustion and despair mixing with a strange sense of wonder. Somehow, under this canopy of stars, I fell into a dreamless sleep. Dawn's touch roused me. My body ached, every muscle protesting as I sat up and took in my surroundings. I had fallen into a valley, a strange hollow carved between rows of houses. It was a place that shouldn't exist, like everything else here, dropped haphazardly into this fractured world. I climbed the slope cautiously, emerging once again into the streets. The suburb had changed. The familiar cookie-cutter homes were gone, replaced by sprawling mansions with wide, manicured lawns. The roads were broader, the air warmer, the trees on distant hills reduced to golden skeletons swaying in the breeze. Even the seasons seemed different. At the crest of a hill, I saw them, jagged pylons scattered across the landscape like broken teeth. They twisted and fused together unnaturally, a testament to the chaotic, grown but not designed nature of this place. This suburb, if it could even be called that, wasn't a creation of logic or intent. It felt alive, a thing that emerged from somewhere beyond reason. I trudged through the neighborhood, my throat dry and stomach hollow. Thirst drove me to search the houses, scanning faded white doors for a sign of water. On my third try, I found a spigot and nearly wrenched it from the wall in my desperation. The water was cold and metallic, but it was enough. Daylight bolstered my courage, and I began knocking on doors. The paint never changed, always that same off-white, but no one answered. When I tried a door handle, it turned easily, unlocked. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I'd seen enough to know that curiosity here was a dangerous thing. Instead, I wandered toward a clearing I'd spotted from the hilltop. My hunger gnawed at me, but something about the sight of those pylons and the open field beyond demanded my attention. When I reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. 36 statues stood scattered across the grass, each one a grotesque childlike figure in the same crude style as the one I had seen before. Twisted rebar, cracked concrete, and rusted pipes formed their bodies, adorned with grotesque details. One had a spiraled metal wig and a faded pink bow atop its head. Another clutched a decayed baseball glove in a hand made of curved rebar. My heart sank as I realized what this meant. This place had once been inhabited. Someone had made these. Someone had lived here. At the center of the clearing lay an ancient basket, its contents long decayed. Only a jar of jam and a pair of rock-hard biscuits remained. I cracked open the jar and tasted the jam, apricot overly sweet but palatable. The biscuits, however, were inedible, their rock-like texture nearly cracking my teeth. The streets remained static this time, letting me retrace my steps to the valley. I chose not to descend, instead sitting in a neighboring yard to watch the sun set. As the sky burned with reds and oranges, I cried again. Nights were cold and restless. Days blurred together as I scavenged what little I could, rationing the jam and surviving on spigot water. Hunger became a constant ache, and I cursed myself for wasting the biscuits. In desperation, I searched for mushrooms or anything edible, but there was no life here. No birds, no insects, nothing. Whatever had happened to this place had driven everything else away. Or worse, it had consumed them. The only reason I didn't starve to death was sheer luck. I stumbled upon a lone walnut tree in the side yard of a house near the hillside. The tree had long since shed its fruit. The husks were rotted, blackened, and brittle. But inside, the walnuts were intact, their meat tough but edible. I smashed them against the crumbling back wall of the house, picking out the fragments that hadn't been spoiled by time. That and spigot water became my entire existence. Even so, I could feel my body weakening. My ribs began to show, my steps growing sluggish as the days bled into one another. I didn't stray far from that small section of stability. Beyond it was uncertainty, danger. From the top of the pylon-dotted hill, I surveyed the surrounding landscape. Hills to one side, and another walled suburb in the flatlands below. It was identical to this one, radiating outward in perfect symmetry. I thought about making the trek there. Maybe I'd find food, water, or even a way out. But fear held me back. Here, I still felt a fragile kind of safety. And, foolishly, I clung to the hope that this place would shift back to its original form, the one I'd stumbled into, and I could find the gate and escape. But hope can be a cruel thing. It happened on a quiet evening, just as the sun began its descent. I was resting under the shade of a willow tree, the golden light of sunset washing over the landscape. At first, I didn't notice him. He blended into the hazy glow, almost indistinguishable from the shimmering horizon. The suited man with the red balloon. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. He was distant, drifting slowly across the sky, yet unmistakable. The balloon, a tiny crimson dot, bobbed weightlessly in his grasp. Panic surged through me. I dropped to the ground and crawled into the nearest bush, inching backward as quietly as I could. I kept my eyes locked on him, praying he wouldn't notice the rustling of the leaves or the faint movements below. He floated closer. I slinked toward the valley, moving through the growing shadows, my heart hammering in my ears. He was headed directly toward me, though whether it was coincidence or intention, I couldn't tell. The valley's edge came into view, and I slid down just as the first tendrils of dusk crept across the land. But he didn't descend. I stopped in the cover of dense trees, peeking out cautiously. The suited man came to rest near the center of the valley, his figure silhouetted against the last sliver of sun. His balloon hovered high above, a blood-red pinprick in the dying light. And then the world unraveled. The light drained from the sky, faster than any natural sunset. The remaining rays twisted and contorted, spiraling toward him like threads being drawn into a vortex. They blackened as they neared him, darkening into a monochrome void that spread outward like an ink stain across the sky. The stars vanished. The moon disappeared. The world was swallowed in pure, suffocating darkness. I pressed myself against the nearest tree, trembling. My own hands were invisible in front of me, and I clung to the rough bark like a lifeline. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear, only the sound of my own shallow breaths. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When I awoke, the world had changed again. I crawled out from the grove cautiously, guided by the faint glow of a distant street lamp. The hidden suburb had taken on a new, grotesque form. The pristine houses were now dilapidated, their roofs missing shingles and their paint peeling away in long, jagged strips. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven, potholes scarring the roads like open wounds. The vegetation had turned wild and unkempt. Grasses grew waist-high, and trees gnarled themselves into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Most chilling of all was the eternal night. The sky remained an endless void, devoid of stars, moon, or any semblance of time. I couldn't tell how many days passed. Hunger gnawed at me relentlessly, and sleep came only in fleeting, restless moments. My thirst became unbearable, forcing me to search for water. Eventually, I found a spigot on the side of a house. The pipes groaned and wheezed as I turned the handle, the sound far too loud in the oppressive silence. I managed a few gulps before paranoia forced me to shut it off. I retreated to the valley's edge, desperate to find shelter. But it was too late. The sound of the spigot had brought unwanted attention. The presence I'd felt on my first night, the thing that had hunted me beneath the streetlights, had returned. I felt it before I saw it, the familiar prickle of dread crawling up my spine. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, humanoid but wrong, slinking near the edge of a dimly lit porch. We locked eyes. In that instant, we both moved. I bolted, no longer caring about stealth. My only focus was putting as much distance as possible between myself and the creature. I sprinted down the cracked streets, taking abrupt turns, cutting through overgrown yards, looping around houses. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the thing was always there. In my periphery, just out of reach but never far behind. It had learned. No matter how many times I zigzagged, no matter how erratic my path, it stayed with me. My body was weaker now, slower, and I could feel it closing the gap. Desperation fueled my movements, but deep down, I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I was running out of options and time. My body screamed in agony. My lungs burned, but I refused to give in. That thing was right behind me, closer than ever. The rushing wind filled my ears, accompanied by garbled cries that sent shivers down my spine. Its voice was wrong, distorted, as though it were being spoken underwater, filtered, and twisted into something inhuman. Yet, amidst the chaos, fragments of words began to emerge. Wait! Stop! I nearly stumbled as I dove through a side yard, glancing back just long enough to see its horrifying form. an unstable, flickering entity. It twitched and vibrated erratically, each movement jarring, as if reality itself rejected its existence. But I couldn't slow down. I pushed myself forward, sprinting down a cracked sidewalk, my legs threatening to give out. Then it spoke again, its voice trembling with urgency. "Please, don't. Keep running." The words froze me mid-step. I turned my head and saw it recede into the darkness, fading as if it had chosen to let me go. Something about its voice unsettled me, a familiarity I couldn't quite place. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing to piece together the fragments of what it had said. And then, I heard it, the rattle of a turning doorknob. The sound pulled me back, my head snapping toward it. There, illuminated by the flickering light of a porch, stood a red door. Its surface gleamed like fresh blood, slick and otherworldly. The hinges screeched as it slowly swung open, the porch light snuffing out in its wake. The darkness beyond the door was alive. I didn't think I ran. No weaving, no doubling back. This thing wasn't something I could outmaneuver. It was all-consuming. It devoured light, snuffing out streetlights with a high-pitched whine and a burst of sparks as it closed in. Each explosion brought it closer, the encroaching void nipping at my heels. Sparks grazed my arm, the heat stinging my skin. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the darkness crept closer. My body was failing. My legs barely held me, my chest felt like it was on fire, yet I kept running, clinging to a desperate hope for survival. The street ahead came to a T-shaped intersection. Left or right would be suicide. Straight ahead was a house, its pale blue door barely visible in the dim light. I didn't hesitate. With the last ounce of strength in my body, I flung myself at the door, crashing against it as the darkness closed in. And then nothing. I didn't tumble through that surreal, shifting landscape from my dreams. Instead, it was like waking from a nightmare at the moment of death. The world jolted back into existence. Concrete. Hard, cold, unforgiving concrete beneath my trembling hands. My body ached. My skin was damp with tears, but the sounds of birdsong filled my ears. I was outside. I had escaped. It took 2 days and 26 miles to make it back home. I was found in the parking lot of an abandoned mall, haggard and starving. When I told the police what happened, they dismissed it with familiar platitudes. Delirium, psychosis, a bad trip. They couldn't explain the weight loss, though. I didn't care. I was alive. That same day, I swore off art forever. I haven't picked up a sketchpad since. For the past 15 years, I've lived as a recluse, still at home with my parents. They think I'm a failure, and maybe I am. But I'm alive, and that's all that matters. In the years since, I've developed countless theories about the hidden suburb, its rules, its iterations, the sun eater, the purpose of the statues, the significance of the door colors. And the echo, the fragmented version of myself that tried to warn me. It was my voice all along, trying to save me from a fate I had seen but failed to avoid. But I won't share those theories. None of it matters anymore. The hidden suburb hasn't returned. I haven't seen its glow from my window, nor the trailhead in the valley. It's as though it never existed. Yet I don't search for it. I won't. I have no doubt it's still out there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to pull someone else into its infinite, twisted grasp. I wouldn't even be telling you this if not for my therapist. She insisted I get it out, that writing it down might help me move on. But there's something else. The real reason I'm telling you this now. 2 weeks ago, during a midday smoke break, I saw it. Floating along the breeze, as carefree as a child's toy, was a red balloon. It had a crudely drawn smiley face. If that blue door was my way out, I know one thing for certain. I didn't shut it behind me. Stay safe out there.